Gabbard leaned into the microphone and said, with a calm that felt almost cruel, that Nancy Pelosi didn't fear foreign threats half as much as she feared losing control of her own narrative. A few people in the audience gasped, and someone immediately shouted why Tulsi would hit that hard when the country was already exhausted by political warfare. Tulsi didn't raise her voice. She simply said that if you want the reason, you watch to the end, because the reason is always hidden behind the part they clip for television. Dan Bongino, sitting 2 rows back like a man allergic to subtlety, muttered that Washington only respects pressure, and pressure is the one language everybody suddenly understands. And Nancy Pelosi, who had survived decades of storms by mastering timing and optics, held her expression steady, because she knew that the first person to look rattled is the first person to lose. The room was supposed to be procedural, the kind of closed-door briefing where staffers drink bad coffee, senators pretend they already read the memo, and the cameras never get the full story. Tulsi stood at the front with the posture of someone who had actually watched consequences arrive in real time, not days later through a press release drafted by lawyers. Pelosi entered with the confidence of a politician who had built a career on turning chaos into leverage, as if every crisis were simply a chance to negotiate from a higher floor. Even before either woman spoke, the contrast was visible, because one carried the discipline of command, while the other carried the discipline of survival. That difference matters, because American politics today is basically a fight between people who believe in control and people who believe in disruption. Tulsi began by describing threats from abroad in the kind of language intelligence officials use when they want to be understood without giving away the entire picture. She talked about cyber intrusions, influence campaigns, and the boring machinery of modern conflict, the sort of warfare that doesn't need uniforms to wreck a society. Pelosi listened without interrupting, but her stillness wasn't respect. It was calculation, because she was waiting for the moment to reframe the entire conversation around legitimacy. When she finally spoke, she didn't ask a question the way curious people ask questions. She asked a question the way experienced prosecutors ask questions. She suggested that Tulsi's posture toward foreign policy sounded too independent, too unpredictable, and therefore too convenient for the enemies everyone already hates. Tulsi didn't take the bait, and that was the first surprise, because Washington runs on bait the way casinos run on oxygen. Instead of defending her patriotism like a rookie, she challenged Pelosi's instinct to turn disagreement into suspicion, as if dissent itself were an intelligence vulnerability. It was a subtle jab, but it landed, because it implied Pelosi's real weapon wasn't evidence, but insinuation. And insinuation is cheap when you own the megaphone. Dan Bongino, never the quiet type, whispered that this was the classic move, because accusing someone of being compromised is a shortcut around having to argue policy. Pelosi's mouth tightened for a fraction of a second, not because the line was devastating, but because it was recognizable, and recognizability is dangerous in politics. Tulsi then pivoted to what she called the domestic credibility gap, and she framed it as a national security problem rather than a partisan talking point. When citizens believe leaders play by different rules, Tulsi said, adversaries don't need to hack anything, because cynicism becomes the malware that spreads on its own. Pelosi countered by saying credibility is defended by institutions, and institutions are defended by people who know how to keep extremists from setting the agenda. Tulsi responded that institutions don't defend themselves with slogans. They defend themselves with restraint, transparency, and an unwillingness to weaponize fear for short-term advantage. The room shifted because everyone understood that this wasn't really about a briefing anymore. It was about who gets to define responsible leadership in a country that no longer agrees on reality. Pelosi tried to corner Tulsi with an old Washington trick, which is to make any criticism of leadership sound like an invitation to chaos. She implied that Tulsi's style, which people label anti-establishment, often becomes a bridge that opportunists can walk across, whether Tulsi intends it or not. Tulsi answered by saying the establishment has become addicted to calling everything a fire, because once everything is a fire, you can justify any emergency power you want. That line was a little humorous in the way it stabbed, because you could practically see staffers imagining the next headline about fire drills on Capitol Hill. Dan Bongino chuckled under his breath, then immediately looked serious again, like a man who knows jokes are only tolerated in Washington when they also function as knives. Tulsi's next point was where the tension sharpened, because she described the optics economy as the real engine of modern congressional power. In her framing, the most important votes happen in public, but the most important incentives are private, and the gap between the two is where trust goes to die. Pelosi rejected the implication outright, insisting that governing requires coalition management, and coalition management requires message discipline, and message discipline looks like control to outsiders. Tulsi agreed that discipline matters, then asked whether discipline is still discipline when it becomes a reflex to silence uncomfortable questions rather than answer them. That question hung there because it doesn't accuse, it doesn't prove. It simply invites the audience to notice how often power treats inquiry like an insult. At this point, the hearing room mood turned slightly surreal, because you had two political animals arguing about morality with the language of strategy. Pelosi talked about protecting democracy by defeating dangerous movements, while Tulsi talked about protecting democracy by reducing the temptation to manipulate the public. The controversial question Tulsi floated carefully was whether the country is safer when leaders win or when leaders remain accountable even when they lose. It was the kind of question that irritates both sides, because it implies your team might be wrong in ways that don't fit into a neat villain story. And if you're wondering why this sounds like the beginning of a bigger confrontation, that's because both women were circling the same truth from opposite directions. Power is easier to keep than it is to justify. Pelosi took a breath, and she did what Pelosi has always done when the terrain becomes unstable, which is to force the conversation back onto a simple moral binary. She suggested that Tulsi's insistence on nuance can become a cover for people who want to blur lines between allies and adversaries because blurred lines help bad actors. Tulsi replied that blurred lines are also created when leaders exaggerate threats for political unity, because fear is the fastest glue and the most addictive one. Dan Bongino later called this the panic premium, because every time you sell panic, you earn attention now, and you pay legitimacy later with interest. Tulsi didn't cite him, but the concept echoed in her tone, because her whole argument was that governance cannot be built on adrenaline forever without eventually producing a crash. Before the chair could move to the next agenda item, Tulsi delivered the sentence that changed the room's temperature, because it wasn't an accusation, it was a dare. She said that if Pelosi truly believes she is defending the country, then Pelosi should have no fear of a public debate about how power makes decisions, who benefits, and who gets protected. Pelosi smiled the way veteran politicians smile when they are about to compliment you while tightening a leash, and she said that serious governance is not a reality show. Tulsi replied that if the public only gets to see governance after it has been packaged, then democracy becomes a product launch, not a system of consent. And right there, with the audience leaning forward and staffers suddenly paying attention like their careers depended on it, you could feel that the confrontation had moved from policy to something more dangerous, which is legitimacy itself. Pelosi shifted from principles to procedure, because procedure is where power hides, when it doesn't want to argue in plain English. She reminded the room that intelligence work is not a stage, and that officials who treat it like a stage endanger the very credibility they claim to protect. Tulsi answered that credibility is not protected by secrecy alone, because secrecy without accountability turns into a private club that mistakes privilege for competence. Dan Bongino, sensing blood in the rhetorical water, murmured that Washington loves rules most when rules can be used as velvet handcuffs on inconvenient people. Pelosi's eyelids flicked toward him for a heartbeat because she recognized the tactic, which is to turn a technical debate into a moral story about control. Tulsi didn't lunge at Pelosi personally, because the fastest way to lose moderate viewers is to sound like you're prosecuting a person instead of interrogating a system. Instead, she framed Pelosi as a symbol of an era, the era where leaders believed the only thing the public needed was the conclusion, not the reasoning. Pelosi countered by saying the public doesn't need every classified detail, and Tulsi agreed, but then asked why the public can't even get a clear explanation of trade-offs. That's where the humor slipped in, because Tulsi compared certain Washington briefings to magician performances where the real trick is making you clap for not seeing anything. Even some staffers smiled, then immediately stopped smiling, because in rooms like this, laughter feels like a confession you didn't mean to make. Pelosi tried a sharper angle, suggesting that Tulsi's independence could be exploited by commentators who monetize distrust, turning serious governance into permanent suspicion. Tulsi didn't deny the media circus exists, but she said the circus grows because leaders keep feeding it, and then pretend they're shocked it keeps returning for dinner. Dan Bongino raised an eyebrow as if to say he felt seen, then leaned back like a man willing to be the villain if it exposes the script. The controversial question Tulsi dropped carefully was whether leaders secretly prefer an angry public, because an angry public is easier to herd with simple slogans. Pelosi objected that anger is a symptom, not a strategy, but Tulsi replied that symptoms become strategies when people learn they can profit from managing them. At that point, the chair tried to steer the conversation back toward foreign threats, because chairs always try to stop a fire before it reaches the curtains. Tulsi complied on the surface, describing adversaries as opportunists who exploit division. But she added that division becomes exploitable when leaders treat citizens like children. Pelosi said citizens are not children, but misinformation spreads like smoke, and leaders must sometimes speak firmly to prevent panic and manipulation. Tulsi said firmness is not the problem, because firmness can be honest, and the problem is when firmness becomes a substitute for proof and humility. Dan Bongino, with a dry tone, said, "Humility has been missing so long in Washington that it would need a lobbyist to get into the building." Pelosi then pressed Tulsi on the core tension, which is whether transparency itself can become a weapon in the hands of adversaries. Tulsi responded that transparency is only a weapon when the truth is embarrassing, and that is precisely why reformers keep demanding it. The room went quiet, in that specific way it does when people realize the sentence can't be dismissed without admitting something uncomfortable. Pelosi regained her rhythm by turning to outcomes, arguing that her style produced votes, protected priorities, and blocked what she called dangerous impulses from both extremes. Tulsi conceded that outcomes matter, but asked how many wins become losses later when trust collapses and people no longer believe any institution is acting in good faith. You could feel the strategic chessboard under the dialogue, because Pelosi was defending governance as management, while Tulsi was defending governance as legitimacy. Pelosi said legitimacy is built through stability and results, and Tulsi said legitimacy is built through honesty, even when honesty is politically costly. Dan Bongino quietly noted that the public can forgive losing, But the public rarely forgives being treated like an audience instead of an owner. Tulsi then laid out a simple premise, almost too simple, that if the government asks citizens to sacrifice, it must show it is also willing to sacrifice. Pelosi's expression tightened again because that premise is universally popular and universally threatening to anyone who has learned to govern through exemptions. Tulsi moved the conversation to a hypothetical because hypotheticals can expose instincts without turning into prosecutable claims. She asked the room to imagine a policy crisis where leaders privately expect one outcome, but publicly sell a different story to maintain unity and win the next vote. Pelosi said that framing was unfair because leaders often speak with incomplete information, and changing narratives is sometimes simply updating the public responsibly. Tulsi accepted the point, then asked the uncomfortable follow-up, which is how the public can tell the difference between responsible updating and convenient rewriting. Dan Bongino smiled in the briefest, meanest way, because that question is exactly what fuels his entire genre of commentary. Pelosi attempted to close the loop by warning that endless skepticism destroys the shared foundation a democracy needs to function. Tulsi replied that skepticism is not endless when institutions supply receipts, timelines, and clear standards that apply to everyone, including the people who write them. She said the problem is not skepticism, the problem is the pattern of being told to trust, then being punished for asking what trust is based on. Pelosi called that a cynical view, and Tulsi said cynicism is what happens when citizens watch leaders demand trust like a tribute instead of earning it like a duty. And right there, with Tulsi holding eye contact and Pelosi holding her composure, the room felt like it had crossed a line from debate into a test of who still believes power has to answer to anyone. The conversation hardened when Pelosi decided to challenge Tulsi not on policy detail, but on political consequence. Because consequence is the currency veterans use when ideals feel slippery. She argued that leadership means choosing which fires to fight and which ones to contain, and that not every truth can be delivered raw without burning the house down. Tulsi replied that the house is already smoldering when people suspect decisions are made behind closed doors for reasons that never survive daylight. Dan Bongino later joked that Washington treats sunlight like a controlled substance, legal only in carefully measured doses, but the humor masked a real anxiety in the room. Pelosi understood that anxiety too, which is why she reframed transparency as a risk management problem rather than a moral obligation. Tulsi shifted tactics, not by attacking Pelosi directly, but by narrating how trust erodes slowly, almost invisibly, until institutions wake up one morning and realize nobody is listening anymore. She described a generation that doesn't feel represented, not because they lost elections, but because they never saw leaders explain decisions honestly when it mattered most. Pelosi countered that explaining every trade-off invites distortion because bad actors will always cherry-pick complexity and weaponize it. Tulsi acknowledged that risk, then asked why the solution always seems to be less explanation instead of better explanation. That question irritated the room because it implies that opacity is often chosen out of convenience, not necessity. The tone tightened when Pelosi invoked history, reminding everyone that moments of national unity were built on disciplined messaging, not open-ended debates. Tulsi responded that unity achieved by silencing doubt is brittle, and brittle unity shatters the moment pressure increases. Dan Bongino, leaning back with his arms crossed, muttered that brittle systems look strong right up until the instant they fail spectacularly. Pelosi shot back that permanent skepticism leads to paralysis, and paralysis invites chaos that punishes the most vulnerable first. Tulsi answered that paralysis also comes from people believing their participation no longer matters because outcomes feel pre-decided. At this point, the exchange stopped feeling like a disagreement and started feeling like two different theories of democracy colliding in real time. Pelosi's theory treated stability as the highest good, something to be protected even at the cost of occasional public frustration. Tulsi's theory treated legitimacy as the highest good, something that cannot survive without visible accountability. Neither woman sounded unreasonable, which is what made the tension unsettling rather than theatrical. Viewers could sense that this wasn't about winning an argument, but about defining what kind of consent still counts as meaningful. Pelosi pressed Tulsi on media amplification, suggesting that her critiques feed ecosystems that profit from distrust more than reform. Tulsi didn't deny that those ecosystems exist, but she argued they flourish precisely because official channels refuse to engage uncomfortable questions seriously. Dan Bongino raised his hands mockingly, as if accepting partial blame, then shrugged in a way that said the demand came before the supply. Pelosi warned that normalization of suspicion corrodes institutions from the inside. Tulsi replied that normalization of secrecy corrodes them faster, because secrecy teaches people to assume the worst by default. Tulsi then introduced a hypothetical crisis, one where leaders privately acknowledge mistakes but publicly double down to avoid political fallout. Pelosi said leaders must sometimes project confidence to prevent panic, even while correcting course quietly. Tulsi accepted the need for calm, then asked whether calm becomes deception when corrections are never acknowledged at all. That question landed heavily because it doesn't accuse anyone of malice, only of convenience. Dan Bongino later summarized it bluntly, saying panic is dangerous, but so is pretending nothing is wrong when people can see smoke. The audience energy shifted again because Pelosi's responses became more defensive, even as she maintained her composure. She emphasized that governing is not a seminar, and that excessive transparency can cripple decision-making. Tulsi replied that democracy is not efficient by design, and efficiency without consent becomes managerial rule, not representation. Pelosi warned that such framing encourages cynicism about all authority. Tulsi said cynicism is not taught, it is learned, usually after people are told to stop asking questions one too many times. As this section drew to a close, the chair attempted to regain control of the agenda, sensing the exchange was drifting toward philosophy. But the damage, or the clarity, depending on perspective, had already been done. Pelosi had defended a system built on message discipline and controlled disclosure. Tulsi had challenged that system by arguing that legitimacy erodes when discipline replaces explanation. And somewhere between those positions, the audience began to realize that the real argument wasn't about who was right, but about how long a democracy can function when trust is managed instead of earned. By the time the exchange resumed, the room felt different, not louder, but heavier, as if everyone understood that the debate had crossed into territory that doesn't easily resolve itself. Pelosi recalibrated, choosing a calmer register, framing her answers as institutional memory rather than personal defense. She reminded the audience that systems are built by imperfect people, and dismantling trust too aggressively can leave nothing functional behind. Tulsi listened without interrupting, which in itself unsettled some observers who expected escalation instead of restraint. Dan Bongino later quipped that silence in Washington often means someone is thinking 3 moves ahead, and that silence made people lean in. Tulsi finally responded by recounting moments from her military service where leaders had to admit errors quickly because lives depended on clarity, not narrative control. She explained that in those moments, credibility wasn't preserved by pretending mistakes didn't happen, but by showing how they would not happen again. Pelosi countered that battlefield logic doesn't always translate to civilian governance, where panic can ripple through markets, alliances, and communities. Tulsi accepted the distinction, then questioned whether fear of ripple effects has become an excuse to delay honesty indefinitely. That framing forced the audience to confront whether temporary calm is worth long-term disbelief. The exchange turned sharper when Pelosi accused critics of romanticizing transparency without accounting for human behavior. She argued that not all audiences seek understanding, and some actively search for fragments to weaponize. Tulsi replied that the presence of bad actors doesn't absolve leaders from explaining decisions to good-faith citizens. Dan Bongino smirked and said that assuming the public is too fragile to handle truth often backfires spectacularly. Pelosi responded that governing requires choosing which risks are tolerable, not eliminating risk entirely. Tulsi then posed a question that hung uncomfortably in the air, asking whether leaders still trust the public they claim to represent. Pelosi paused before answering, a rare hesitation that didn't go unnoticed. She said trust is not binary, that it exists in gradients shaped by experience and responsibility. Tulsi countered that when trust becomes conditional, representation quietly transforms into supervision. The room shifted again because supervision is not a word democracies like to hear applied to themselves. As the discussion deepened, subtle humor began creeping in, perhaps as a release valve for the tension. Dan Bongino joked that Washington loves transparency the way cats love baths, theoretically admirable but practically avoided. Even Pelosi smiled briefly, acknowledging the truth embedded in the joke. Tulsi used that opening to argue that discomfort is often the first sign of necessary change. Pelosi warned that discomfort can also be exploited by those who don't care what replaces the old system. The conversation circled back to accountability, with Tulsi arguing that systems only correct themselves when consequences are visible. Pelosi responded that consequences exist, but they often operate quietly to prevent destabilization. Tulsi asked whether quiet consequences are meaningful if the public never sees them. That question resonated, because unseen accountability feels indistinguishable from no accountability at all. Dan Bongino later summarized it by saying that secret discipline is like secret justice, technically possible, but publicly meaningless. Pelosi grew firmer, insisting that relentless exposure risks turning governance into permanent spectacle. Tulsi replied that spectacle already exists, fueled by secrecy and speculation filling the vacuum left by explanation. Pelosi argued that some narratives cannot be corrected once unleashed. Tulsi answered that narratives form regardless, and leaders choose whether to shape them honestly or surrender them entirely. The tension now felt less like conflict and more like an unresolved paradox. As this segment closed, it was clear neither side had converted the other, but something else had happened. The audience was no longer watching a clash of personalities, but a clash of governing philosophies laid bare. Pelosi defended a model built on stability, caution, and message discipline. Tulsi challenged that model by insisting legitimacy cannot survive without visible accountability. And the question lingering in the room was no longer who sounded stronger, but which approach a skeptical public would still believe when the next crisis arrived. The fifth movement of the confrontation unfolded more slowly, almost deliberately, as if both sides recognized that escalation would only cheapen what was already at stake. Pelosi leaned back, her posture signaling experience rather than retreat, and spoke about legacy, not her own, but the institution's. She warned that when politics becomes a permanent trial, every decision is retroactively criminalized by whichever faction gains the microphone. Tulsi listened carefully, then replied that legacy is not preserved by shielding institutions from scrutiny, but by proving they can survive it. Dan Bongino later remarked that Washington fears audits more than elections because audits don't care about speeches. Pelosi reframed her argument, suggesting that critics underestimate how fragile democratic norms actually are. She argued that once people believe corruption is universal, they stop demanding better and start excusing worse. Tulsi countered that disbelief often comes from feeling lied to, not from hearing uncomfortable truths. She pointed out that cynicism doesn't emerge from transparency, but from discovering transparency was never real. The audience reacted quietly because that distinction cut close to home. The discussion pivoted toward power itself, how it accumulates, and how rarely it willingly disperses. Pelosi described power as a tool that must be held firmly, or it will be seized by those least qualified to wield it. Tulsi replied that power clung to for too long becomes indistinguishable from entitlement. Dan Bongino joked that power in Washington has a rent-controlled lease and never seems to expire. Even Pelosi laughed briefly, though the humor didn't soften her position. Tulsi pressed on by asking who decides when power should change hands, voters or party elders. Pelosi responded that voters decide outcomes, but parties decide viability, framing it as practical realism rather than manipulation. Tulsi questioned whether practicality has quietly replaced principle as the primary filter for leadership. That question lingered because no one in the room could deny how often practicality wins. Dan Bongino muttered that realism without ethics eventually just becomes management of decline. The exchange then touched on loyalty, an uncomfortable topic in any political space. Pelosi spoke of loyalty to caucus, to shared goals, to keeping a fractured coalition intact. Tulsi acknowledged the necessity of teamwork, but warned that loyalty without limits breeds silence when silence is dangerous. She argued that loyalty to truth must outrank loyalty to alignment. The tension rose again, because that hierarchy is easy to praise and hard to practice. Pelosi's tone hardened slightly as she warned against elevating individual conscience above collective responsibility. Tulsi replied that conscience is precisely what prevents collectives from rationalizing harm. Dan Bongino interjected that history rarely condemns people for asking hard questions, but often condemns those who punish them for asking. Pelosi answered that history also condemns chaos disguised as courage. The room seemed split, not by party, but by temperament. As the segment neared its end, the debate felt less like an argument and more like a mirror. Each position reflected a fear the other side didn't fully acknowledge. Pelosi feared collapse through overexposure and institutional erosion. Tulsi feared rot through secrecy and unchallenged authority. Dan Bongino summed it up by saying that one side fears fire and the other fears mold, and both destroy houses differently. When this part concluded, no applause followed, only a low murmur of unsettled reflection. Viewers weren't choosing winners anymore. They were choosing which risk frightened them more. Was the greater danger instability born from relentless exposure, or decay hidden behind controlled narratives? The debate had stopped being about personalities entirely. It had become about what kind of uncertainty a democracy is willing to live with. The final stretch arrived without theatrics, almost quietly, which somehow made it heavier than everything that came before. Both sides seemed aware that closing words don't settle arguments. They frame how arguments are remembered. Pelosi spoke first, her voice steady, reminding the audience that democracies rarely collapse from one dramatic failure, but from slow erosion of shared belief. She argued that when citizens stop believing in institutions entirely, they don't replace them with something better. They replace them with something louder. That line landed because everyone had seen how volume often substitutes for substance in modern politics. Tulsi answered without raising her voice, and that restraint carried its own authority. She said belief cannot be commanded or managed. It has to be earned repeatedly, especially after mistakes. She argued that asking people to trust without showing them why is no longer persuasion. It's expectation without consent. Dan Bongino later remarked that trust used to be a bridge, but now it's treated like a toll road with no exits. The audience laughed softly, then grew quiet again as the point settled. Pelosi made one last appeal to experience, to the idea that longevity in public service carries lessons that impatience cannot replace. Tulsi acknowledged that experience matters, but warned that experience unchallenged hardens into habit. She said habits built for yesterday's crises can quietly fail tomorrow's realities. That wasn't an attack, it was a warning, and it sounded like one. For a moment, even Pelosi seemed to consider it. The exchange closed with a question rather than a verdict. Tulsi asked whether democracy survives by protecting itself from the people or by trusting them enough to risk disappointment. Pelosi did not answer directly, instead saying that leadership often means choosing between two imperfect futures. Dan Bongino summed it up with his usual bluntness, saying that America isn't choosing between right and wrong anymore, but between different kinds of regret. That line lingered longer than any accusation. As the cameras pulled back, there was no clear winner, no viral knockout, no single sentence to clip and replay endlessly. What remained was discomfort, the kind that doesn't fade after the video ends. Some viewers would side with stability, others with confrontation, many with neither completely. And maybe that was the point, that the real divide isn't partisan, but philosophical. Because once the noise fades, the question still stands. If those who govern no longer trust the governed, and the governed no longer trust those who govern, what exactly is holding the system together?